It began in the highlands of East Africa, over 2,000 years ago. In the region that is now Uganda and western Kenya, a powerful migration had already begun, one that would reshape the languages, cultures, and nations of the African continent. This was not a conquest driven by armies or kings. It was a quiet, determined movement of families, farmers, and herders, people looking for new land, better rainfall, and peace. These people were the early Bantu speakers, and among them were the ancestors of a group that would one day be called Nuni. This journey would last centuries. It would cover thousands of kilometers, crossing rivers, forests, and deserts. These were people who knew how to live off the land. They brought with them cattle, iron tools, and the gift of language. As they moved southward, they met other communities. Some they absorbed, others they learned from. But through it all, they kept something alive: their way of life, their family names, and their identity. And at the heart of that identity was a word that would survive every change, every war, and every kingdom. That word was Nguni. To understand its true meaning, we must go back before the time of the Zulu kings, before the rise of Shaka, before colonial borders. We must return to the very beginning of the Nguni identity, when it was not yet a label for a people, but a lineage, a name, possibly even a man. The story begins with a migration, one of the largest in ancient human history. Scholars today call it the Bantu expansion. Beginning around 2000 BCE, small farming communities speaking Bantu languages began to spread out from a homeland believed to be somewhere near the Cameroon-Nigeria border or the Great Lakes region of East Africa. These early Bantu speakers carried with them new ideas: agriculture, iron smelting, and a deep respect for cattle. As they moved south and east, they didn't come as conquerors, but as settlers. And over time, they transformed every region they touched. By around 500 CE, groups of Bantu-speaking people had reached what is now Tanzania and Zambia. From there, some continued south into Mozambique and South Africa. But among them were distinct clans who moved closer to the coast, following river valleys and green hills. Their cattle thrived. Their crops grew. They settled. But they did not forget where they came from. In the early oral traditions of southern Africa, the name Nguni appears not as a nation, but as a person. According to several Nguni-speaking communities, including the Zulu and Xhosa, Nguni was the name of an ancestral figure, the founder of a major clan. In these stories, Nguni was a man who had many sons, and from these sons came the various branches of the Nguni people. While historians today caution that this is more symbolic than literal, the consistency of this oral memory across several groups is remarkable. It suggests that Nguni was not just a random word. It was an important identity passed down for generations. What makes the name so interesting is how it remained strong across space and time. As people moved, split, and formed new communities, the memory of Nguni stayed. But the word itself was never just about blood. It began to mean more. It came to represent a way of speaking, a way of dressing, even a way of respecting elders and performing rituals. The Nguni identity became cultural, not just genealogical. Linguists have found that the Nguni languages, Zulu, Xhosa, Swazi, and Ndebele, form a tight group within the southeastern Bantu languages. This tells us that their speakers remained closely linked for a long time before spreading out into different kingdoms. Even today, these languages are mutually intelligible to some degree. A Zulu speaker can often understand parts of Xhosa or Swati, and vice versa. That's because these groups share a common root, not just linguistically, but historically. Archaeological evidence shows that by around 1000, early Nguni-speaking communities had begun to settle more permanently in the coastal and inland regions of what is now South Africa. They lived in small villages, raised cattle, and used iron tools. They practiced rituals that honored the spirits of their ancestors and followed clan-based systems of leadership. Cattle were not just food. They were wealth, status, and sacred links to the past. This would remain a central part of Nguni life for centuries to come. One of the most important archaeological discoveries that supports this timeline is the site of Mapungubwe in northern South Africa, near the border with Botswana and Zimbabwe. Though Mapungubwe is more directly linked to the ancestors of the Shona and other groups to the north, its rise around the 11th century shows how complex African societies were becoming. Trade, farming, and social hierarchy were all evolving. And while Mapungubwe declined by the 13th century, the cultural and economic foundations it represented would influence communities farther south, including the Nguni speakers. As these early Nguni clans spread, they began to take on distinct identities. Some moved east and became the ancestors of the Xhosa, who settled along the Eastern Cape and developed their own proud history. Others remained in the interior, evolving into what we now know as the Zulu. Some crossed into what is now Eswatini, becoming the Swati. Others moved north, later forming the Ndebele, but the name Nguni remained a thread running through all of them. By the 1500s, Portuguese explorers and traders had reached the southeastern African coast. They wrote down what they saw: large communities organized under chiefs, speaking similar languages, herding cattle, and practicing rich spiritual traditions. Though the Europeans did not yet call them Nguni, the shared patterns were clear. These were people with a deep connection to land, lineage, and law. At this point in history, Nuni was still not a political word. It was not yet tied to empire or power. It was a name of origin, of belonging. It was passed through oral history, remembered in praise poetry, and spoken in everyday greetings. It was not used to divide, but to connect. When Zulu elders sang of their ancestors, they named Nguni. When Xhosa families performed rituals, they honored the same traditions that likely began in East Africa generations before. What makes the story of Nguni even more impressive is that it survived so many changes. Colonization would come later, bringing violence and displacement. European scholars would try to classify African people using categories they didn't understand. Governments would later draw hard lines between language groups and tribes. But the name Nguni endured, not as a label forced from outside, but as a memory kept alive from within. In modern times, the word has become a term of classification, used by historians, linguists, and anthropologists to group these related ethnic and linguistic communities. But for the people who carry the name, it means something deeper. It means pride in a shared past. It means recognition of deep roots. And it means connection to each other, to the land, and to a name that has survived the rise and fall of kingdoms. Today, the legacy of Nguni is everywhere. In the rhythms of South African music, in the click sounds of Xhosa speech, in the praise songs of Zulu warriors, in the spiritual rituals of Swazi ceremonies. All of it flows from the same ancient source, a word that began with a journey and became the symbol of a people. And yet, this is only the beginning of the story. By the year 1600, the many branches of the Nguni-speaking people had settled widely across southern Africa. They were no longer just one migrating community. They had grown into powerful clans, each with its own leaders, customs, and regional influence. But they still carried the same cultural foundation, shared language roots, cattle-based economies, and strong oral traditions. From the green hills of KwaZulu to the river valleys of the Eastern Cape, the Nguni legacy was alive and growing. This was the age when clans began turning into chiefdoms. Leaders who once managed small families and cattle herds were now controlling thousands of people, organizing raids, collecting tribute, and making alliances. In these centuries, the future nations of the Zulu, Xhosa, Swazi, and Ndebele were taking shape, not as fixed tribes, but as living communities built around loyalty, identity, and survival. One of the earliest written records referring to these groups comes from Portuguese traders and missionaries in the 16th and 17th centuries. Though the Europeans didn't always understand the structure of African societies, they took notes. They described large communities that lived in kraals, circular homesteads made from wood and earth, centered around cattle, and ruled by chiefs who were respected, not just for their power, but for their connection to ancestors and spirits. These were Nguni societies in their classical form. But while the world was changing, the land of southern Africa remained mostly untouched by outside influence until the early 1800s. This was when everything shifted. The Nguni world, once spread peacefully across the land, entered a time of deep conflict. A storm was coming, and it would be led by a name that would echo through all of African history: Shaka. Shaka Kasenzangahona was born around 1787 in the southeastern part of what is now South Africa. He was a member of the small Zulu clan, which at the time was a minor part of the larger Nguni-speaking Mthethwa Confederacy. Shaka's father was a Zulu chief, but his birth was considered illegitimate, and his early life was marked by hardship and rejection. But from this pain came power. Shaka would rise to become the most feared and admired warrior of his time. By the early 1800s, Shaka had taken control of the Zulu clan after the death of his father. He then began to reshape the way Nguni warfare worked. Traditionally, battles were brief and symbolic. Clans would fight, but often with limited casualties. Shaka changed all of that. He introduced new weapons like the short stabbing spear, called the Ikulwa, and trained his men to fight in tight formations. He built regiments, drilled warriors daily, and turned the Zulu into a military machine. His success wasn't just in war. Shaka united scattered Nguni-speaking groups under a single banner, forming what we now call the Zulu Kingdom. His rise, however, sparked a chain reaction across the region. As clans either joined him or resisted him, violence spread. People fled, territories shifted, and many other groups began forming their own powerful kingdoms in response. Historians call this period the Mfecane, meaning the crushing or the scattering. During the Mfecane, the entire southern African region was reshaped. The Ndebele people, led by Mzilikazi, broke away from the Zulu and fled north, eventually settling in what is now Zimbabwe. Along the way, they defeated many groups and established new dominance. The Swazi, in present-day Eswatini, also began to centralize power in order to protect themselves. Even the Xhosa to the south, already powerful, had to navigate the changing politics caused by these massive shifts. Through all this chaos, the idea of Nguni did not disappear. In fact, it became more visible than ever. Even as kingdoms fought each other, they shared a deep root. They still spoke related languages. They still told the same origin stories. They still practiced the same ancestral rituals. The wars of the 1800s were not wars between foreigners. They were internal conflicts between relatives, often sparked by hunger, drought, or European interference. The British and Dutch settlers who had begun colonizing parts of South Africa were shocked by the strength of the Nuni-speaking nations. When the British first encountered the Xhosa in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they found a society with strong leadership, complex diplomacy, and rich spiritual traditions. The British called them Kafirs, a derogatory name that erased their real identity. But the Xhosa knew who they were. They sang of Nguni. They traced their lineages back to ancient ancestors. They remembered. As colonialism grew, the British clashed repeatedly with the Nguni nations. Between 1779 and 1879, a series of wars broke out, 9 in total, between the Xhosa and the British, known as the Xhosa Wars, or Cape Frontier Wars. These battles were long and brutal, and they were not just about land. They were about identity, survival, and resistance. Even after losing territory, the Nguni spirit remained unbroken. Further north, the Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo would face off against the British Empire in the famous Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. The most well-known battle from this war was the Battle of Isandlwana. On January 22, 1879, Zulu warriors, armed mostly with spears and shields, defeated a well-armed British force. It was one of the greatest defeats the British Army ever suffered in Africa. The Zulu victory shocked the world. Newspapers in London were stunned. How could a so-called tribal force defeat one of the world's most powerful empires? The answer was simple. The Zulu, like all Nguni-speaking peoples, had a long tradition of military organization, discipline, and deep cultural unity. They didn't see themselves as tribes. They were nations, and their history didn't begin with European arrival. It stretched back through centuries of migration, resistance, and pride. Despite their strength, the colonial period would bring tragedy. The British, after initial defeats, returned with greater force. They crushed the Zulu army at the Battle of Ulundi. They imprisoned King Cetshwayo. They eventually broke up the Zulu kingdom, dividing it into smaller units to weaken its power. The same process happened across Nguni lands. The Ndebele faced conquest by the British South Africa Company. The Xhosa were forced off their lands. The Swazi had to make deals to preserve what was left of their independence. But even as political borders were redrawn and rulers overthrown, the name Nguni did not vanish. It remained in the people's language, in their ceremonies, and in their memory. The colonial governments tried to group African communities into rigid tribes for easier control. But for the people, the old connections still lived. They knew that Zulu, Xhosa, Ndebele, and Swazi were not completely separate. They were branches from the same root. In the 20th century, as African countries began fighting for independence, historians and linguists began to explore African history more seriously. They stopped relying only on European sources and started listening to African voices, oral traditions, and indigenous languages. In these studies, the word Nguni re-emerged, not just as a name for a people, but as a cultural system, a language group, and a shared identity. Linguists noted how the Nguni languages, isiZulu, isiXhosa, Siswati, isiNdebele, had features that marked them as a tight-knit family. These included complex noun classes, shared vocabulary, and even similar praise poetry styles. Cultural anthropologists found that the rituals of ancestor worship, the role of cattle in society, and systems of leadership followed parallel paths across all Nguni groups. This was not coincidence, it was heritage. The apartheid government in South Africa tried to use ethnic divisions to control the population. They created homelands based on ethnic lines, hoping to keep Zulu, Xhosa, and others apart. But the strategy often failed. People moved, spoke each other's languages, and remembered the deeper connection. In resistance movements, Nguni speaking, people stood side by side, whether they called themselves Zulu or Xhosa. They knew they were part of the same struggle. By the end of the 20th century, with the fall of apartheid and the rise of a democratic South Africa, the pride in Nguni heritage grew. People began reclaiming the stories that had been hidden or erased. Schools taught the real history. Museums displayed the ancient artifacts. And scholars continued to trace the word Nguni back through time. Today, Nguni heritage is not just a matter of language or ethnicity. It is a living culture. It is in the music of Miriam Makeba. It is in the words of Nelson Mandela, who spoke Xhosa. It is in the traditional dances of rural villages and the poetry of modern artists. The word Nguni is no longer just history. It is identity, dignity, and resilience. But how exactly did the name Nguni survive all this time? What made it so powerful, so unbreakable? So far, we've followed the journey of the Nguni, from mysterious early migrations to the rise of great kingdoms like the Zulu and the Xhosa. We've seen how the word Nguni survived wars, colonization, and political divisions. What does the word Nguni actually mean? Where did it come from? And how has it continued to shape identity, culture, and science even into the 21st century? Let's begin with language. In most Nguni languages, like isiZulu, isiXhosa, Siswati, and Ndebele, the root Nguni appears in several contexts. It doesn't just refer to people. It can also connect to concepts like lineage, honor, and sacred ancestry. Linguists believe that Nguni was originally the name of a powerful ancestral figure or group, possibly a chief or elder whose descendants carried his name. Over time, the name became associated with a broader identity. Even today, in traditional praise poems or izibongo, we hear phrases like Bantu bakanguni, the people of Nguni. This is more than a label. It's a declaration of heritage. It means we know who we are and we remember where we come from. Among Zulu and Xhosa communities, clan names, iziduko, are passed down through generations and hold deep spiritual meaning. A person's clan name links them to their ancestors. Forgetting or disrespecting this name is seen as forgetting your soul. Some of the most ancient clans, like Mthethwa, Nkobo, Dlamini, trace their roots back to early Nguni formations. Even when people live in cities, far from traditional homelands, they are taught to honor their clan line. That's how strong the identity remains. But identity is more than memory. It's also encoded in the body, in DNA. In the last 20 years, genetic studies have explored the roots of Southern African populations. What they've found is powerful. Nguni-speaking people, along with Sotho-Tswana groups, carry a mix of ancient lineages that tell a long story of migration, blending, and resilience. Mitochondrial DNA passed through mothers shows links between Nguni people and ancient East and Central African populations, which supports the oral stories of early migrations. Meanwhile, Y chromosome studies, passed through fathers, reveal patterns tied to the Great Lakes region, suggesting that some ancestors of the Nuni may have come from areas near modern Uganda or Kenya over 1,500 years ago. There's also evidence of intermarriage with indigenous Khoisan groups. Many Nguni speakers carry Khoisan genetic markers, especially in areas like the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. This shows that the migration wasn't a takeover, it was a blending. Nguni people didn't just arrive, they adapted, learned, and became part of the land. This genetic evidence matches what historians and anthropologists have long argued, that the Nguni identity is not a tribal box, but a dynamic, evolving culture. The name Nguni represents a journey of bloodlines, languages, and shared survival. And it's not just DNA and language that carry the legacy. Cultural practices also hold the thread. Take, for example, the Umemulo ceremony among the Zulu. This rite of passage, where a young woman is formally introduced into adulthood, includes dancing, singing, and the giving of gifts, especially cattle. Similar ceremonies exist among Xhosa and Swazi people, with variations but similar meanings. These rituals honor ancestors and reinforce community. They also preserve stories, because during such events, elders speak, chant, and teach. Imbizo gatherings are still held, traditional community meetings where people discuss problems, settle disputes, and honor customs. The format, the language, the values, all trace back to the shared Nuni system of governance that existed long before colonial rule. Even in spiritual life, Nguni traditions continue. Many Nguni-speaking people believe in a supreme creator, known as Unkulunkulu among Zulu and Uthixo among Xhosa. But daily spiritual life is centered on the ancestors, Amadlozi or Abafansi. People pray to them, offer food or beer to them, and call on them for protection. This is not paganism. It is a sophisticated belief system rooted in reverence and memory. It ties people to the land, to their families, and to the unseen world. Let's now return to the name itself, Nuni. Where exactly did this word come from? While some say it was the name of a founding ancestor, others believe it came from an ancient description of cattle-raising people, possibly related to the Bantu word root Nguni, meaning original or pure. This theory suggests that as these early families moved into southern Africa, they called themselves the original ones, those who came first. Over time, the word became a badge of honor. Still others connect Nguni to the word Inkunzi, the Zulu word for a bull. Cattle, after all, were central to Nguni life. They were used in trade, marriage, lobola, ritual sacrifice, and status symbols. A chief with many cattle had power. A family with cattle had honor. Some believe the Nguni saw themselves as a proud people, like the bull, strong, steady, and noble. Whatever its exact origin, the word Nguni became sacred. It crossed rivers and valleys. It survived empires and invasions, and it lived on in the people. In modern South Africa, the Nuni legacy is everywhere. 4 of the country's 11 official languages are Nuni tongues. These languages are taught in schools, used in government, and spoken by millions every day. Music artists, poets, and filmmakers use Nuni languages to tell new stories rooted in old truths. Even as the world modernizes, these traditions are being carried forward. Artists like the late Johnny Clegg fused English and isiZulu in songs that told the story of South Africa's struggle and soul. Authors like Sindiwe Magona and Credo Mutwa have written deeply about Nguni traditions. Cultural heritage organizations continue to record oral histories, dance styles, and folk tales so that younger generations don't forget. And across the diaspora, especially in the Americas, people of African descent are rediscovering the richness of Nguni culture. Some have traced their DNA back to southern Africa and now study Zulu or Xhosa language and history. Museums and universities are opening programs on African spiritual systems, traditional healing, and indigenous governance. In Zimbabwe, the Ndebele continue to honor their Nguni roots, even while embracing new national identities. In Eswatini, the Swazi monarchy still performs ancient rituals that go back to the founding Nguni heritage. And in South Africa, both urban and rural communities still pass down clan names, proverbs, and praise poems. So, what does it mean to be Nuni today? It means being part of a story that began before borders, before nations, before colonizers. It means being part of a people who moved with the seasons, who raised cattle and songs, who built kingdoms and resisted empires. It means remembering that Africa's history is not lost. It is alive, in language, in ritual, in blood, and it means understanding that Nguni is not just a word, it is a worldview, one that values community over individualism, one that honors the past while embracing the future, one that sees identity not as fixed, but as a living thread connecting generations. As we close this journey, let us return to where we began. The name Nuni may be ancient, but it still walks with us. It lives in the languages we speak, the names we carry, the songs we sing, and the ancestors we call. It is not just a label, it is a legacy. That's the true story of where the word Nguni comes from. It's not just a name, it's a deep history, full of real people, powerful kingdoms, and strong traditions. The Nguni people have been here for thousands of years, and their story still lives on today. If you learned something new, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who should see it. And tell us in the comments, what African story should we tell next?